Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Johnson. How are you this morning?
Good. Hello. And I want to welcome everyone to our conversation on lessons on policing from the Capitol siege. My name is Vida Johnson, and I teach at Georgetown in the two criminal defense clinics that we're lucky to have. Prior to coming to Georgetown, I was at the public defender here in Washington, D.C. And I write generally about criminal procedure, but in the last few years, I've started to write about the connection between white supremacy and policing. I'm excited to talk with all of you about this important topic, but I'm really excited to get to spend some time with Christy Lopez. Professor Lopez is someone whose work I've long admired and someone who I count as a friend. And so I'm really excited for this opportunity to have some time to chat with you. So Christy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, and absolutely the same. Vida, I've been missing you. I've been wanting to have chat with you and get coffee with you. I didn't expect that it would be over this topic, unfortunately, but I'm at least glad that we're able to have this conversation. It's an important conversation, especially I think after yesterday. I don't know about all of you, but I'm so relieved that well, for a number of reasons, including the fact that there was no violence yesterday. At least here in the Capitol related to the inauguration. But at the same time, I'm acutely aware that we had 25,000 troops here, and we were essentially under lockdown. And I don't think any of us wants that to be a requirement for safety in our lives or wants that to become normalized. And for me, that really underscores the importance of our conversation today. We need to figure out what happened at the Capitol, how it happened, why it happened, so that we can prevent that sort of violence and that sort of threat, literally, to our democracy without the kind of show of force that we saw on display yesterday. I think that's the ideal that we're all hoping for. I'm just really happy. I'm always happy to talk with you, Vida, especially about a topic that you know so much about. So I wanted to start with that, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so I've certainly noticed that since the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th, we have seen more writing about the infiltration of policing and the military by white supremacists than I've certainly ever seen. It's been an issue for a while, but I've not seen as much written about it in the popular press. You have written about this extensively. You have actually testified in Congress about this, and you know a fair bit about it. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the link to white supremacy and related extremist ideologies, and among those at the Capitol on January 6th, not only in the crowd, but perhaps also among law enforcement, and help us place this in the context of white supremacist infiltration of police more broadly.
Okay, yeah, sure. Unfortunately, there's a long history of explicit bias and white supremacy on police departments in this country. Some of the very first police departments in the United States were groups of white men in the South who decided to police the comings and goings of enslaved people. And that continued. We know that police allowed the lynching of at least 3,000 Black people without any legal consequences for those who participated in those murders. But, this isn't just something from our distant.
If I can just jump in here to add that it was also, of course, in the Southwest in particular, the Texas Rangers and others visited terror on Mexican Americans with lynching, which often, they weren't hangings, they're often shootings, but a similar dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't just something that is just in the distant past, something for the history books. We know that there were scandals in police departments in the 1980s and 1990s. And as recently as 2014, it was discovered that there were police officers in Florida who were part of a KKK chapter there. In, I think, 2015, an Alabama officer was alleged to have been a member of the League of the South, another white supremacist group. We know that an Oklahoma police chief ended up being discovered to be one of the most influential white supremacists in the United States at the time. He owned a record label, a website. He was in a couple of documentaries about white supremacy. And just in 2019, two prospective homebuyers were looking at a home that was owned by a Michigan police officer, and they found a framed KKK application hanging in his house, allegedly. And so, there is this problem of police officers that are in hate groups, but the problem is much bigger than that. We have officers who hold explicitly racist views or far right views, who are not don't belong to any hate group, that express these views in other ways without affiliation in a group, and who may not even understand that their views are outside the norm. So my own research found that there were over 170 posting scandals, either on social media, emails, or texts, where police officers were saying explicitly racist things. And so this is a problem that is not just something that I've looked into. The Plain View Project found thousands of not just racist texts and social media posts, but also sexist, homophobic, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, so many truly offensive things. And just so that people don't think this is just a teeny tiny number of police officers here and there, we know from a poll in 2017 that 10% of Americans, right, this was right after Charlottesville, right after the unrest there, found that 10% of Americans found it was acceptable to hold neo-Nazi views. And just this month, a Reuters poll, right after this Capitol siege, found that 12% of Americans supported the cause of the rioters. So we have to assume that a similar number of police officers hold these extremist views. And the number may be even higher, the percentage maybe even higher on police forces when you consider that white men are overrepresented on police forces when you compare that to the rest of the demographics of the rest of the United States. So this is something that's particularly frightening when you consider that police officers have weapons, they have access to sensitive information, and they wield a tremendous amount of power. And we know that the FBI warned us of this problem back in 2006, and very little was done. This is something that we all need to be thinking about because it makes us all less safe. It makes it difficult for police departments to recruit diverse people onto their ranks. And I'm so happy that Georgetown is paying attention to this really important problem, and that the rest of the country has started to look at this as well. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to add.
Well, I was just going to say that, I've had certainly my work at the Department of Justice when I was investigating police departments and writing findings reports. We certainly saw this dynamic in many of the departments we investigated. And the two that just jump out are Ferguson and Chicago. In Ferguson, of course, we found, I think this was in large part because it's a relatively small department. And I remember the day they gave us the flash drive with all of their emails on it. And we just searched through them and found really horribly racist emails, many of them involving the president at the time, Barack Obama, and his wife, Michelle Obama. And to me, that really underscores how the race and the political components of the bias have become intertwined in recent years. And then in Chicago, we looked at their social media and just really rampant bias. Again, not all officers, but a very strong thread of officers who were anti-Black, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant. This is not something that is isolated. At the same time, of course, it's not as if it's every officer. As you point out, 10 to 12, nor is it really, is it sort of limited to police, right? And as you point out, 12% of Americans overall support what the rioters did. And we think that there's reason to believe that these numbers are at least as high or higher than in policing. But that also tells us it's not confined to policing, which I think has to impact how we respond. So I really appreciate that, and what you found for your research is certainly consistent with, unfortunately, what we found during our investigations at the Department of Justice. Although not everywhere, not at the same level at every department, which is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But right now, I'm hoping I have another question for you, which is about a piece that you wrote for The Conversation, where you talk about, and you just started to allude to this, that the failure to confront this problem has deadly consequences, right? And some people, there's this tendency, I think, as civil libertarian Americans, people should be allowed to think what they want, even if we find those ideas abhorrent. But this seems different for a number of reasons, including the ones you point out. These officers have guns. These officers have the power to take life and liberty. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the failure to confront the problems of white supremacist thinking and policing has had deadly consequences?
Sure. I think specific to the Capitol, there's probably at least three ways that it's had deadly consequences. Off-duty police officers felt safe to go be part of at least the rally that took place. And when we think about what that rally was about, it was about not counting the electoral votes of an election we just all gone through. I mean, it's kind of scary that police officers, off-duty police officers, thought like, oh, I can take a day off of work and go to this rally. We know that at least 34 officers are under investigation, officers from all over the country, for the role they may have played in what took place on January 6th. 2 officers, my understanding, have been arrested for actually being inside the Capitol. And of course, those are allegations at this point, but that's something that should really be disturbing to all of us. There are some who believe that Capitol Police that day may have helped facilitate the attack. We've all seen the video of officers taking selfies with the crowd. There are reports that officers, at least one officer, took off his department issued hat and wore a red "Make America Great Again" hat, in the middle of this confrontation between the public and the people who were supposed to be protecting the Capitol. And so that really brings me to my third point, is that people felt buoyed. The rioters felt buoyed by the fact that they believed that the police were on their side. That waving a Blue Lives Matter flag was going to inoculate you from any consequences for your role in this attack. I mean, that's scary that people believe that about police. And I'm not sure that's, as you said earlier, a world that we all want to live in, that you can disrupt Congress taking part of their, doing their constitutional duties, and that the police will be on your side. So, I think those are 3 ways that we can see how it had the failure to confront this issue has had deadly consequences. And this is, unfortunately, a problem that we've seen, that law enforcement wants to sweep these issues under the rug. They want to, I think in a self-preservation way, say it's a bad apple, it's a rogue officer, it's a lone wolf, when this is a problem in police culture, and it makes us all less safe. Christy, I think I might have cut you off. Were you going to add something?
No, not at all. No, not at all. I completely agree. And I'm especially interested in you're linking it to policing culture.
Yeah. So I did that on purpose because I'd love to know your thoughts on this. I've written about how bias in policing culture may have resulted in folks downplaying the risk of attack and being overly sympathetic, police being overly sympathetic to the rioters. So I was interested in what your thoughts might be about how bias in policing culture rather than the views of particular officers might have impacted the response to the attack on the Capitol.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question because I'm very happy that the issue of white supremacist infiltration and thinking among officers is getting more attention. It's long overdue, but I continue to believe that it's the systemic structural bias in policing more broadly that has a more broadly harmful impact. And even in very direct ways, like it doesn't root out those individual officers. But I also just want to talk a little bit about the fact that, it might seem disconnected, but I very much think that it is this race bias intertwined with political bias that caused to large extent what happened at the Capitol. It's not quite that simple, and I'll get into that in a moment, but I think, it's in policing, sometimes it can seem like everything is about race, and sometimes it is. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge here. But first, I kind of want to make two things clear before getting into that. One is that I think this is another example. What happened at the Capitol on January 6th is another example of how we, the people, spend years creating a social problem. When it finally boils over, the police are left to deal with it, right? And they don't always do that well. Trump, former President Trump, and his enablers, including some of those who were endangered in this attack, they are the ones who fabricated the lies and created the climate that spurred this mob. And I think we have to name that and acknowledge that, because that if all of us had done a better job tamping that down, this never would have become a policing issue. And so we have to recognize that what happened at the Capitol is as much or more a societal problem than a policing problem. And that's an important element. We have to stop thinking that, oh, well, the police are supposed to protect us from everything. We have to prevent some of these problems from occurring in the first place. The second thing I want to just really make clear is that this could have been a bloodbath, and it wasn't, and that is a good thing. That, in my view, is an extremely successful element of the police response here that hasn't been sufficiently acknowledged to my view. We need to see that kind of response emulated more broadly, especially when the crowds of people are not lead pipe, pepper spray wielding people who have sworn to overthrow the government, but they are protesters protesting for social justice who are people of color, right? Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That is, obviously, to most of us, it was a very disparate response, but I don't want to diminish the fact that there were people killed, and that's that died, and that's terrible, but it could have been so much worse, and that is a very good thing. But it's obvious, that said, it's obviously unacceptable that the rioters were able to enter the Capitol, that people died, that a core democratic function was delayed and disrupted, that laptops with sensitive information were taken, and we have to figure out how that happened, and we have to do everything we can to prevent it from recurring. And from what we can tell, and I want to also make clear that we're at a relatively early pre-investigation stage. There are inquiries that are going on to try to figure out what exactly happened. But it seems pretty obvious that the Capitol Police and possibly other federal and local law enforcement agencies underestimated the threat, and that as a result, they were unprepared. And that's why this happened. And that's, it is that lack of preparation by the deciders, the decision makers, more than the actions of any particular officer that allowed this to happen, right? So, based on what we know so far, however many racist, white supremacist infiltrator officers there might have been on the scene, we know there were many, many selfless and courageous officers at the Capitol that day. We've all heard the story of Eugene Goodman leading the mob away from lawmakers. He was the one who was caught on video, but we've seen and heard glimpses of other officers doing equally important, the work that we want police to do, right? And so we have to keep that in mind. And in my view, that underscores how the views or the actions of any individual officers were not the primary problem here. The problem was an agency-wide lack of preparation. If they had been prepared for the attack, they would have had more officers there. They would have, activated mutual aid agreements earlier. They would have been equipped with riot gear. They would have been drilling since November 7th, when the election was certified. The Capitol would have been fortified before, not after the attack. And the crowd would have been held further from the Capitol. And all of those things, what we know from decades of doing sort of work with crowd control and civil disobedience, is that when you're prepared, you can actually help de-escalate and keep people safe without the use of force, much less deadly force. And that's, I think, something we need to really think about. How much of that do we tolerate? How much of that is okay, especially when you compare what happened on January 6th with what happened on January 20th. None of that happened here, right? And that there are indications that this was both because of racial and political bias. And that, I think, to answer one of the questions that's coming in, it's not so much just that or only that or even that the rioters might have been provoked by racist sentiments. It's that the lack of an adequate response was caused in part by a failure to adequately, objectively assess the nature of the threat and to prepare accordingly, right? I think this is just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, in some instances of failure to sort of apprehend a threat might be explicit bias, but in another, it might be implicit bias, those unconscious biases where we know that people might overestimate a threat posed by a Black person. And here it looks like maybe underestimated the threat posed by this group of people because they were a largely white crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any of the decision makers or any of the officers that day said, hey, I'm going to not shoot my gun, or I'm going to not fortify the Capitol because I care more about, these, boogaloo boys than I do about Black Lives Matter. Maybe there were a few, but that's not the problem here. The problem is that they looked at this and they said, oh, they have Blue Lives Matters t-shirts. Oh, my cousin looks like that. How much problem can they really be causing? Yeah, well, they said they want to go in and stop the electoral vote. You actually had lots of intel, objective intel, that they were going to disrupt things. And the fact that that intel was not heeded, to me, really underscores the role that race plays and why we have to recognize that race can play that very fundamental role, even when it seems like it's not. And for me, this is really, we have to also be mindful of the dual level that it plays that role on, and that this happens at. I wrote a chapter called The Dual Crisis of Policing in a book on crisis lawyering. And I focus on Ferguson, but it applies here and in many other of the places I investigated. And it talks about how there's a chronic crisis in policing and an acute crisis in policing. And this is a great example of both at play. The chronic crisis of policing, one element of that is the race and political bias in policing generally, right? And we saw that in the spring and summer protests. You compare those to what happened here, we see that they generally underestimate the threat from white people and from people they consider supportive, and they overestimate the threat from people who are protesting in social justice movements, who are much more diverse crowds, largely Black, Indigenous, people of color. That is, they look at the individuals rather than what they are saying and what they are doing and what they are threatening in assessing the threat, right? So here you had people who were wielding lead pipes, they had pepper spray, they had, documented before their intent to invade the Capitol, and they were not prepared to defend the Capitol against what these individuals said they were going to do. In other protests, we see police doing things that are often escalating, kettling protesters, firing on protesters, not giving them warning. I think that's part of the chronic crisis of policing. And that's something we need to address broadly. The other level that we need to address this on is what I call the acute crisis. And that's the problem with the Capitol Police specifically. Capitol Police officers and Hill staffers have spoken about the disparate preparation for this compared to other events. There was one, I read of one officer talking about how a Black officer, Capitol Police officer, talking about how offended he was in the preparation for Louis Farrakhan coming to visit the Capitol. And they had a SWAT team, staged in the garage just in case, and they had everybody on alert. And there was no threat of anything. But it was because of his political background and arguably because of his race, right? That they had this response. Another Hill staffer said, look, I'm Black. If I tried that, they would shoot me dead. I'm confident of it based on my interactions with them. Now, that's anecdotal, but I think there's been a lawsuit filed about race by the Capitol Police. There have been longstanding concerns about the Capitol Police and race. And I think we have to look at those as part of the inquiry that's happening, to look at not, we have a chronic crisis in policing, but that doesn't mean it has to play out the same way everywhere. And are there things that can be done in the Capitol Police to address the acute crisis that might have facilitated this from happening?
Yeah, I mean, talking about those accounts from officers I mean, there's that BuzzFeed article. I don't know if you saw
I
it, from the
know.
two Black officers, and one of them said, we were all issued gas masks. We just weren't told to bring them to work that day. And I just find that so stunning, especially in light of what we know about the kind of intelligence that the Capitol Police was getting the week before and even the day before this attack. They didn't seem to have the flashbangs that could have been used to disperse the crowd. It really just all seems, more than a bit surprising. And I think that's what's raised a lot of eyebrows about what's going on with the Capitol Police, particularly because they are such an opaque police department. I mean, it's hard to get information about a lot of police departments, but the Capitol Police Department in particular is accountable really to no one except for Congress. You can't FOIA the Capitol Police. We don't even know the demographics of the police department. I think the last time we got any data was from that lawsuit that you mentioned, Christy. So it's all.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Vida. And, our colleague Rosa Brooks wrote about in the Washington Post a piece on specifically the Capitol Police and how opaque they are. And honestly, that holds true for for all of the federal agencies. They tend to be much more opaque than state and local agencies. And we've tolerated that. And I think we need to stop tolerating that. And this incident really underscores why.
Yeah, so well put. Well, I'm going to ask you, Christy, given that you led the investigations and wrote the reports for Ferguson, Chicago, New Orleans police departments, did you see this coming? And do you think this is something that could happen anywhere?
Yeah, so I can't say that I predicted this particular incident in any way, shape, or form, but I felt a little bit as I did after George Floyd's death, that I was horrified, but I wasn't particularly surprised. And I was a little surprised at how surprised everyone was. I do think that in a better run department, and again, we don't know this for sure, but there do seem to be some red flags that in a better run department, this might not have happened. They might have been better prepared regardless. But what happened at the Capitol is exactly what you would expect given that chronic crisis of policing that I referred to earlier. What I learned from my work in Ferguson and New Orleans and Chicago and LA and Newark and all over the country is that police are very capable of both over and under policing simultaneously, right? So the Capitol Police have 2,300 officers and over a $500 million budget every year. That's a lot. That's 10% of the legislative budget. 10% of our legislature's budget goes to the Capitol Police, right?
San Diego has a smaller police department, and they're the 8th biggest city in the country.
Right. And New Orleans, which has a significant crime issue, 1,300 officers. Oakland, 800 officers. The Capitol Police, who have control over about 2 square miles, 2,300 officers. Now, it's different, right? But the point being that you have to figure out what is it you want your police to do and then make sure they're doing it, not just throw money in officers and then not question them when they say, oh, we need more. And because when you do that, you have a dynamic that people have been noting about local police departments forever, which is they're everywhere when you don't need them and nowhere when you do need them. And that is exactly what we saw on January 6th with the Capitol Police. And that can't be okay. The other thing I learned again is that race and political bias impacts how policing happens. Again, what's the connection? It may not seem clear at times, but certainly in Ferguson, we already mentioned the rampant jokes, the racist jokes that they had. You can go to our report to read more about those, but that was intertwined with the structural racism of how they meted out their fines and fees and how they actually policed on the backs of poor Black people in Ferguson to raise revenue for the city. It was intertwined with their response to the protesters in Ferguson, which engendered international reaction and rage. The same in Chicago. As I mentioned, their social media really revealed this very strong thread of bias. And that same bias informed a very carceral response to people and families that actually just needed help and needed community building responses, not arrests in jail. And so I think that it is that race and political bias that impacts how policing happens in ways that can seem disconnected from race or bias that we need to really acknowledge.
Yeah. You've talked a little bit about the budget of the Capitol Police. And, I know that's one thing that, I worry about, that the end result of all of this will be, not less money for police, but, more money for police. And I think, that's something we should think about. And so I'd love to hear from you, especially because you had that great op-ed in the Washington Post. Like, what happened at the Capitol on January 6th tell us about defund movements and where they're going, police abolition movements? Like, yeah, what can you say?
Yeah. So, and I taught a course on police abolition this past term. So if any of my students are listening, thank you. I learned so much from all of you as well. That really informs my thinking on this. And I understand why some people think that this incident raises the question, that whether the defund movement is just naive. And I think that's just too facile an assessment of what happened and what we're seeing. I think certainly the January 6th reflected many of the failures that the defund movement has been seeking to highlight, right? That you can spend lots of money on police and they won't be effective when you need them to be, that bias can cause over and under policing both, that police are capable of a lot more restraint than they often show when they're dealing with perceived threats from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And of course, that we don't have enough oversight and transparency in policing. Now, abolitionists and people in the defund movement, they say that this reflects a system, right, that's can't be fixed because it's either too broken or, as Paul Butler says, our colleague Paul Butler says, it's not broken at all. It's operating as it was intended to. It's fueled by a carceral logic steeped in our history of racial bias and some say racial capitalism. But even the abolitionists, at least all the ones I've talked to in real life, acknowledge that we need a group of first responders to respond fairly and effectively to incidents just like the one at the Capitol, even as they call for working on those underlying social conditions that facilitate those sorts of incidents, right? And to me, I think that can be framed as the need for policing transformation. And January 6th heightened rather than undermined the call for policing transformation. So that said, I do think that this incident underscores the complexity of the issue, and I hope it will deepen our collective understanding of how we go about transforming policing. And I think there are 3 lessons in this respect. First, I think that this incident underscores the likelihood that, at least for the foreseeable future, that if we don't have regulated public safety first responders, we will have unregulated private police, and that would be far worse, right? At best, I think we'd have private police the way that that wealthy communities currently enjoy. They hire their own police. And everyone else would be unprotected. And at worst, I think this incident for me, I saw on display my fear of a world without a public safety response, which is basically roving bands of pathetic, but extremely dangerous and racist and fearful men and women, like those we saw at the Capitol. And frankly, like those, I know it seems like a long time ago, but it was less than a year ago that Ahmaud Arbery was killed in Georgia by a group of men stalking him and killing him, forming that private policing function in their minds. And I really fear that if we didn't have police, that's what we would have. And that's what I mean when I wrote in that Washington Post op-ed that we're dealing with pathologies that are broader than policing. To be clear, we still need to have police that are we need to have a more holistic understanding of public safety, and we need to end our over-reliance on policing to respond to all of our public safety needs. But that just leads to the second lesson, which is that we need to recognize that structural racism is more harmful than racism at the individual officer level. I think this incident, for reasons we've already talked about, showed us that. And then finally, the third lesson is a really important one to me, and one that I haven't heard talked about enough. And that is that we really need to hear and learn more from line level officers. You know, officers can be racist and complicit, as your work has shown, and as my work has also shown. And they can also be incredibly selfless and heroic. And many police officers care as much about these issues or more about these issues than any of us, right? Um, the 2017 Pew Research Center poll that you referred to earlier, right? It asked the police and the public if the country has made the changes needed to give Black people equal rights with white people. Now, 92% of white officers said that the country had done enough, but only 29% of Black officers had said that, right? That's, in half the public had said that America had done enough. And at Georgetown, I co-direct with Rosa Brooks, the Police for Tomorrow program. And we have many officers, it's a very diverse group, Black and non-Black, who similarly absolutely recognize that much more needs to be done. And I think those voices are really important and insights are really important to transforming policing. And I think it's been a mistake for some recently in the movement to reject those voices and perspectives and really to reject all dialogue with officers and agencies. I think when we do that, we're rejecting allies that might be essential to bring about some of these changes. We're rejecting people who are in a unique position to protect rights. And we're rejecting people whose rights might have been violated themselves. I think we have to be a little more nuanced about how we approach this problem and recognize that the world that you're talking about, that we're both talking about, of white supremacist infiltrators exists alongside the world of officers who would do anything to protect people from those same people. And that is a conundrum, no doubt, but it is the real world that we have to confront.
Yeah. Well, Christy, when the time that we have left, I was thinking it would make sense for us to talk about kind of what we hope to see, what kinds of reforms are necessary. I know one thing that, I think about is this idea of the blue wall of silence, this idea that, police officers don't kind of tell on other officers because of, they're concerned that, the officers who, maybe hold explicit bias or maybe planning on going to a rally that's inappropriate, that they're too afraid that that officer will see, if he reports him, he'll see that his fellow officer at work the next day. And so I want to sort of figure out with you in the time that we have left, like what reforms might be out there and what you kind of see on the horizon. I know that one thing that I've written about and thought about is that, I would like to see police officers, when they violate the law, that prosecutors prosecute them. For a long time, we know that police officers, seem to face very little consequences, not only from their employer, but also from prosecutors. And I know that you and I have both thought long and hard about the role of police unions. So I don't know, in the time we have left, I want to sort of touch on that and see, what you think and about how we can fix that.
I definitely have thoughts, but I would love to hear a little bit more from you first, about this particular problem, because it's so recently been surfaced broadly, of how you actually get rid of officers who have these white supremacist views about, all of us, or most of us, the vast majority of us have some level of bias, and it's not possible to rid the world of bias or to rid a police department of bias entirely. And that's a different conversation for a different day. But when you have officers who are, who are framing KKK applications or who are espousing on social media hate, what do you do? What are your thoughts about, especially the First Amendment, right? And I love that amendment, want to protect it. How do we balance that, that with really this problem of white supremacist officers infiltrating our officers, developing these views while on the job?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer the First Amendment concern because I know that comes up a lot, and a lot of people are rightly concerned with the First Amendment rights of police officers, especially if what they do off duty, right? And let me first say that there are people on our faculty that are in a much better position to talk about the First Amendment than I am. But I just wanted to say that, from my own research, it's clear that we limit public servants' speech in a lot of other contexts. So judges, for example, we limit their speech. They're not allowed to take part in political organizing or political fundraisers.
Mhm.
Federal employees face a lot of limitations in what they do. And through my work on white supremacy and police officers, I stumbled upon this Second Circuit case that I think really frames the issue well. So there's a case that's about some conduct that two police officers and two fire department officers in New York City were involved in. They were on this took part in a very racist float during a larger some holiday parade, and it was called Black to the Future, and they wore offensive clothing, and they had all sorts of other horrible things like fried chicken and watermelon, and it was just awful. And so it was videotaped, and they were fired, and they then sued to challenge their firing. And it wound its way up through the courts. And the Second Circuit found that even if we assume that their speech was protected, and particularly, given extra protections because they were off duty, that their behavior didn't, in those First Amendment rights they enjoyed, didn't outweigh the police department's need to have the trust of the community that they were protecting. And I think that's just a nice framing for legislatures to understand when they are looking to create new reforms. So we can limit police officers' speech to some extent, and we shouldn't be overly concerned with that because there are other more important interests. Obviously you can choose whether you want to be a police officer, but if you're going to be a police officer, you can't do things that undermine the public's trust in you. So yeah, and
Yeah.
I
think it's really important, right? It's a choice to become a police officer and a choice to hold those views. Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead, Christy.
Well, I was just gonna say, to this question of where do we go from here and how do we prevent this? I think there are there's the broad things we need to do, and there's a couple of police specific responses. I do think we need to do a better job up front from preventing problems that eventually devolve into needing a police response. And this is something I've been talking and thinking about a lot. And I think that applies here as well, right? We've got to tamp down much earlier on leaders who trade in lies and hate and bias that fomented this. We tolerated that. And I personally didn't, you personally didn't, but our leadership did, and we need to sort of, maybe all of us, I could have done more to sort of protest that. But I think that the idea is that we have expected to be able, many people have expected to be able to do this with impunity. And that's part of over-relying on police to protect us, right? And this just shows that's not a good rationale. We have to get at these problems, including this kind of problem, much earlier. So whether you're talking about drug addiction or mental illness or people who believe lies about, QAnon, we have to really try to address those earlier and not say, oh, if it ever really, reaches that point, the police will handle it. No, that's not a fair expectation for any number of reasons. And it causes so much harm along the way, all of those things. So I think that's one thing. And that's why I need to keep working at this broad police transformation, including dismantling the structural racism that we've talked about. And for the police specific responses, I think we need to demand a more objective threat analysis and better preparation, right? Not a more aggressive response. There's a question in the Q&A, well, what did the Capitol Police actually do wrong? I think we need to wait for the inquiry to find out what the Capitol Police actually did wrong that day. But as far as I can tell, for the most part, quite honestly, they did the best they could with a very bad situation that was foisted upon them by a lack of preparation that was caused in no small part by race and political bias, right? And that's why I'm focusing on the race and political bias, not like what training did this officer have and why didn't that officer do X? Yes, there's probably many things they could have done differently and better, but again, they did not protect property, but it is always more important to protect life. It would have been much better if no lives had been lost, but we have to understand that we have to recognize that many more lives could have been lost. And I think, again, we don't know yet whether they could have done a better job given the position they were put in, but I certainly think they would have been put in a better position if we had been better prepared. So that's one thing. And then part of that, I think it would be a huge mistake, and this addresses another question we had in the Q&A, to say, oh, well, we just need them to be more aggressive next time. And we need more aggressive laws. We need more domestic terrorism laws. That has never worked. Not only has that never worked, but what it's ended up doing is entrenching the race and political biases that have got us into this mess in the first place. Because next time, somehow always seems to apply to Black, Indigenous people and people of color, right? Always, applies to people who are religious or political marginalized groups, not to the people who, not the Timothy McVeighs of the world, right? They are the ones who prompt the new, onerous laws, and it never really changes. We have plenty of laws. It's a matter of how you enforce them. So I think that would be a huge, the wrong response here, either to demand a more aggressive response next time or more aggressive criminal laws. What we do need is better preparation that's not, infected by bias. We also need to conduct an inquiry of the Capitol Police, which is going on, because we do need to figure out exactly what happened here. Why was that preparation? Is this is just another manifestation of the chronic crisis of policing, or there are acute crises here in the Capitol Police that we need to address to better enable them to respond appropriately in the future? And then we need to hold people accountable, and we need to fix the systemic deficiencies that inquiry shows. So I think they're pretty straightforward things, but we just need to actually do them and pay attention and not forget about this and turn our attention to other things as life goes on. Any other thoughts, Vida?
I agree with everything you said, Christy. And, I woke up this morning and thought, oh, it's a new day. And then my thoughts turned to this conversation we were going to have. And I really hope that our attention doesn't move on to the next thing. We're in a new administration. I'm sure there's going to be this inclination to, move forward and not look back. And I really think that we have to resist that desire. We have to confront all of the circumstances that led to what happened on January 6th, or will happen again. I think this is a great opportunity for us to close our program, but Georgetown law students have another link if they want to join us for our Q&A session that'll start at 11:55. Is that right, Christy? Yeah, right, 5 minutes?
That's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
This has been fun.
I'm going to click the link and we'll be there at some point. But thank you, Vida, so much for sharing your work and your thoughts on this with us today.
Same to you. This has been really, really informative for me and really helpful in framing this issue. And it was fun. And I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Talk to you soon. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you all for being here today.
Bye. Thank you.